It was a homecoming party 50 years in the making. David Santiago and his family had been forced out of their home on Delancey Street in Manhattan in 1967 to make way for an urban renewal project. Residents were promised the right to return to the new buildings. But then, for decades, no housing was built, as factions in the neighborhood battled over the project. Mr. Santiago did not wait around. He led a peripatetic life that took him to the Marines, California and, finally, back to the Lower East Side. But late last year, with the project finally in progress, he moved back in. A raconteur and self-taught chef, Mr. Santiago had spent days at the end of February preparing fish, chicken, tacos, and pastéis, the Puerto Rican specialty, for the party celebrating his new apartment at 175 Delancey Street. But when friends and family arrived in the lobby of his building on March 3 for the housewarming, he did not respond to their calls. His older brother Edward called the police, who forced their way into his apartment only to find Mr. Santiago, 57, dead in his bed of a heart attack. "Once I saw that, I lost it," said Edward Santiago, 60. "I kept yelling his name. He was so happy about the apartment, and what a view." The picture window in the living room of Mr. Santiago's one-bedroom apartment offered a view of his beloved Lower East Side, where he would point out the former locations of Ratner's Delicatessen, Loews Apollo Theater, Rosario's Pizza, and the police precinct where the 1970s TV show McCloud was filmed. Mr. Santiago, whose tough guy persona, tall tales, jokes and uncanny ability to imitate his Italian, Jewish, and Mexican neighbors often put him at the center of any gathering, had lived an unusual life since joining the Marines at 16. "My brother always liked to take charge," said Edward Santiago. "He took care of you. He started working before I did. He was the life of the party and he loved to feed people." Mr. Santiago got his passion for food from his mother, Dolores Guzman, who still lives in the neighborhood but is ill. Their parents broke up when Mr. Santiago, Edward, and their sister Alma were very young. At one point, Ms. Guzman had a Spanish restaurant opposite Tompkins Square Park. Later, she opened a restaurant in Brooklyn. She and the children's stepfather, a bookie, raised the children. Mr. Santiago was barely out of grammar school before he was shining shoes at the Spot Bar, a hangout on Delancey for local mobsters. From there, he made pizzas at Rosario's, next door to the Apollo Theater, on Clinton Street, where his brother said that the operator, Sal Bartolomeo, treated him like a son. In an interview in December, Mr. Santiago said that he loved the potato leek soup and the cheesecake at Ratner's. Also on Delancey, he said there was a shop selling the best cuchifritos in New York. When their family was forced to move out of their apartment in 1967, to make way for what was called the Seward Park Urban Renewal Area, the Santiagos moved to Avenue D, Alphabet City, a war zone in those days, Mr. Santiago said. Later, they moved to a building on Grand Street built by the Archdiocese of New York. In the meantime, the city demolished the buildings in the Seward Park area, leaving parking lots. The land became contested territory, as local housing advocates pushed the city to build apartments, while the mostly Jewish residents of nearby co-ops, backed by the Metropolitan Council on Jewish Poverty and the former Assembly Speaker Sheldon Silver, opposed housing in favor of retail and commercial space. A succession of proposals collapsed amid the fracas. In 1977, Mr. Santiago was 16 when he joined the Marines and went to basic training at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina. But after about a year, his mother prevailed on the Marines to send her underage boy home. A couple of years later he moved to San Diego and fell in love with California and the ocean. He met Trudy Gomez not long afterward, in April 1981. They quickly became a couple. She said she was impressed by his boldness in moving to the West Coast and his desire to make something of himself, the charmer that he was. The rest is history, Ms. Gomez said. He was a character, a schmoozer, she said, using a distinctly New York term she learned from him. I thought, how cute, he talks like Barbarino. Mr. Santiago was off on a commercial fishing boat when his first son, David Jr., was born in March 1982. David still has a photograph of our first meeting, on the tuna dock. But, Ms. Gomez said, Mr. Santiago was sick for most of his time on the high seas, some of it off the coast of Cuba. Soon, he and a friend opened a market, Ocean Fresh Seafood. By 1990, despite lacking formal training, he was a chef, opening the Picasso restaurant, whose menu mixed Italian and Japanese items, with Phil Rose, a lawyer and a former minor league catcher affiliated with the Los Angeles Angels. Mr. Santiago and Ms. Gomez, who had a second son, Dominic, had broken up by that point. Over the years, he owned several other restaurants, or helped develop concepts or served as executive chef in both New York and Los Angeles. At the time of his death, Mr. Santiago was dreaming of opening his next restaurant, Coquille de Suba, featuring Spanish and Caribbean dishes. This time, his son was going to help. I was going to be involved this time, to help make better business decisions, said David Santiago Jr., a general contractor in San Diego. He was real old school. He did a lot of things without contracts, on a handshake. Maybe, here in New York, those type of agreements held up better. His sons and their friends loved his big personality. He wove his experiences from the Lower East Side, the Marines, and his work on a fishing boat into his tales. They pictured him as a wise guy, David Santiago Jr. said. He loved that. He'd exaggerate a little bit so his stories were that much more interesting. He'd been around so he had a lot of stories to tell. But in 2010, Mr. Santiago moved back to New York to help his mother. He also looked after his brother, who had been in a near-fatal motorcycle accident. He occasionally returned to San Diego to dote on his grandchildren and in the process became reacquainted with Ms. Gomez, who he called his best friend. He would always talk about the yuppie people moving to the Lower East Side, his son Dominic said. It was a bittersweet thing because the old neighborhood wasn't his anymore. Still, Mr. Santiago applied for an apartment for returnees to Delancey Street last year, after the city finally approved the Essex Crossing project. Mr. Santiago, who had been sleeping on his mother's sofa for the past 7 years, said he was thrilled in December when he got the keys to his apartment. Between Thanksgiving and Christmas, he turned out hundreds of pastels using his secret recipe, serving them to family and selling others for $30 a dozen. One customer bought $300 worth. Edward Santiago said he didn't have the business smarts, David Santiago Jr. said. But he definitely knew the kitchen. He was very creative and artistic.